On this date in 1916, the British Army had been firing artillery at the German lines for 7 consecutive days, 1.75 million shells. They believed nothing could have survived the bombardment. At dawn on July 1st, 100,000 men stood in the trenches and waited. Most of them were volunteers. At 7:30 exactly, the whistles blew. Then, 100,000 men climbed out of the trenches and ran forward. The German wire had not been destroyed. The German soldiers had sheltered 30 feet underground and were unhurt. They climbed out, manned their machine guns, and opened fire on the British lines. By nightfall, 57,470 British soldiers had been killed or wounded. Their names are carved at Thiepval. It remains the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. On this date, in 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from modern-day Papua New Guinea. She had 7,000 miles left to complete her round-the-world flight. She would never land again. For 18 hours, she flew her Lockheed Electra over open ocean. No GPS, no radar, just a compass, a navigator, and a radio that kept failing. At 8:43 in the morning, she transmitted her position. That was the last anyone ever heard. A Coast Guard ship waited at Howland Island to guide her in. Their logbook from that morning fills up with the same words, Earhart unheard. The Itasca burned oil to make black smoke so she could see it from the air. She never saw it. The U.S. Navy launched the largest search in American history. They found nothing. On this date in 1844, the last 2 of their kind were alive on a rock off Iceland. A collector in Reykjavik wanted those specimens. He paid 3 men to go and get them. They rowed out to Eldey Island, a place so remote it had kept the birds safe for years. When the men climbed up, they found exactly 2 great auks. The birds didn't run, they just walked away. Jon Branson and Sigurdur Isleifsson grabbed them by hand. The 3rd man crushed the last great auk egg under his boot. The skins were sold, stuffed, put behind glass in a museum in Brussels. The species that survived 100,000 years ended so someone could own one. The island is still there, the guillemots still nest on those same cliffs. But one species is missing, and it always will be. On this date in 1997, NASA chose the 4th of July to make history. 7 months earlier, they'd launched a spacecraft into the void, 119 million miles of nothing between it and its destination. It hit the Martian atmosphere at 17,000 miles per hour. The heat shield glowed white hot. For 4 minutes, the engineers could do nothing but wait. Then it bounced, a cluster of airbags the size of a house. Mission Control exploded. Engineers who'd spent years on this project wept at their desks. The next day, a 23-pound rover named Sojourner rolled down a ramp and left the first wheel tracks on another world. Rochester, New York celebrated Independence Day like every other American city. Flags, parades, speeches about freedom. The next morning, July 5th, a man walked into Corinthian Hall to give an Independence Day address. 600 people had paid 12.5 cents each to hear him. Frederick Douglass had escaped slavery 14 years earlier. He walked to the lectern and the room went quiet. He opened by praising the Founding Fathers. The audience relaxed. Then he turned. "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. He spoke for 2 hours. No one left.
You boast of your love of liberty.
When it was over, the hall erupted. Frederick received a standing ovation and applause for what became his most famous speech. The Holy Roman Emperor invited Jan Hus to Constance. Jan Hus was a Czech priest who said the church had become corrupt. He had been promised safe passage to defend himself. Instead, they locked him in a stone cell. He wrote letters to his friends in Bohemia for 8 months. On July 6th, they brought him into the cathedral in full priestly vestments. Then they asked him one more time to take it all back. He refused, so they stripped every vestment from his body, one piece at a time, reciting curses over each one. Then they placed a paper hat on his head, painted with devils, and the word arch-heretic. He was forced to walk through the streets of Constance to the city gate. Contemporary witnesses said he walked calmly. He had already made his choice months before. He was burned at the stake on July 6th. Witnesses said they could hear him singing as the fire took him. When it was over, they threw his ashes in the Rhine River. When the news reached Bohemia, 452 nobles signed a document calling his execution a crime against their nation. Within 4 years, the Hussite Wars had begun, and what would be called the Bohemian Reformation. In 1912, a jeweler in Missouri looked at a loaf of bread and thought, someone should build a machine that slices this. He sold his 3 jewelry stores to fund it. By 1917, he had a working prototype. Then a fire burned down the factory. Blueprints gone, machine gone. He opened a notebook and started again. It took another 10 years. The finished machine was 5 feet long, 3 feet high, with 21 parallel steel blades.
Wow.
Otto Rosetta stood in a bakery in Chillicothe, Missouri, and watched his friend Frank Bench place the first loaf into the machine. It worked. The loaf came out the other end in perfect uniform slices, wrapped in wax paper. The first sliced loaf in human history. In 2 weeks, bread sales at the Chillicothe Baking Company went up 2,000%. Within 5 years, every major bakery in America was slicing bread, and somewhere in those first years, someone said it, the greatest thing since sliced bread. They meant it literally. On this date in July 1947, a rancher named W. Brazel was checking his sheep after a fierce thunderstorm in New Mexico. That's when he found it. Scattered across his remote field were strange pieces of debris, light metallic, yet unlike anything he had ever seen. He brought some of it to the local sheriff, who contacted the Roswell Army airfield. The debris was described as lightweight and metallic fragments that reportedly returned to their original shape when crumpled. On July 8th, the base issued a press release that stunned the world. The Roswell Army airfield has recovered a flying disc. The news was instantly a global sensation. Had humanity finally made contact? But just hours later, a new press conference. General Roger Ramey appeared. He announced it was all a mistake, just a high-altitude weather balloon. The world was told it was nothing. Rancher Brazel said he'd seen weather balloons before. This was something different. On this date in 1958, 3 fishing boats anchored overnight in one of the most remote bays in Alaska. Nobody knew what was coming. The mountains began to shake. At 10:15 in the evening, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck the Fairweather Fault directly beneath the bay. At the head of the bay, 90 million tons of rock dropped into the inlet. The impact was heard 50 miles away. The water that was displaced ran up the opposite mountainside, 1,720 feet. 524 meters, taller than the Empire State Building. The largest wave ever recorded. The Edry shot up the wave face. At the crest, Ulrich looked down through his pilot house window and saw the tops of trees beneath his hull. The Badger was thrown over the spit into the open ocean. Its crew survived in a skiff, paddling with a chair. The Sunmore simply disappeared. They were never found. At dawn, a geologist flew over. Every tree below the waveline was gone, stripped to bare rock. The logs floated 5 miles out to sea. The trim line on that hillside is still visible from space today. Every country in Western Europe had fallen to Nazi Germany. Britain stood alone, but Britain had a secret weapon, chain-home radar, the world's first operational radar network. They couldn't see when the enemy was coming, but radar could. Each block was a formation of German bombers. Scramble, the phone call, every pilot dreaded. From board to airborne in under 3 minutes, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had over 2,500 aircraft. Britain's Royal Air Force had just over 700 fighters. The odds were not in Britain's favour. They scrambled anyway.
High above the Dover Straits, the summer sky turns hostile. The sky is thick with the enemy. Dozens of German bombers and fighter escorts, packed in tight formation, an unstoppable force heading for the heart of Britain. The English Channel, once a protective moat, now serves as a highway for an empire. The formation scatters into a chaotic ballet of tracer fire, burning metal, and desperate manoeuvres as the battle for the skies over Britain begins.
In the chaos of aerial combat, at speeds above 300 miles per hour, the Luftwaffe painted yellow recognition markings on their aircraft, so German pilots could identify each other instantly. That night, searchlight beams swept the sky over England, and they would not stop for 3.5 months. The Battle of Britain was officially over on October 31st, 1940. It lasted 113 days. The air battle cost 544 lives. Winston Churchill was quoted as saying, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The year is 1405. In a shipyard outside Nanjing, something the world had never seen was waking up. 317 ships, 28,000 men, the largest naval fleet in human history. Each treasure ship was 480 feet long. When the fleet moved, the Yangtze River disappeared beneath it. The people on the banks had never seen anything like it. Neither had anyone else on Earth. The night before departure, the emperor fed every officer of the fleet. In the morning, they would face the open ocean. The admiral was captured as a boy of 10 and made a servant of the empire. He became its greatest admiral. His name was Zheng He. From the top of the mast, in every direction, as far as the eye could reach, there were only sails. China had not just launched a fleet, it had launched a floating city. Fun fact, Zheng He's flagship was as long as 1.5 football fields. Columbus's Santa Maria was shorter than one of its masts. In 1433, the emperor died. They burned the maps and outlawed ocean sailing. China had forgotten it ruled the seas. London, July 1962. This Thursday night, in a basement on Oxford Street, something was about to begin. The Rolling Stones were about to play their first gig.
The band name was chosen in panic during a phone call. Brian Jones picked up a record and flipped it over to see a song titled Rolling Stone Blues. When asked what his band was called, he replied, Rolling Stones.
The Marquee Ballroom held 200 people. Nobody in that room had heard of the Rolling Stones. This was the stage where it started. 5 young men nobody had ever heard of, taking a stage nobody cared about, in a basement nobody would remember. Then the first chord. 20 minutes in, the jazz crowd had stopped sitting down. The room had changed. They were paid 30 guineas, split 6 ways, roughly £5 each. The greatest rock band in history charged £5 for their first night. Then they went home. From earning £5 a night to a $500 million world tour in 2005, the Rolling Stones never stopped. It started with a name on a phone call and £5 each in a basement bar on a regular Thursday night.
July 13th, 1930. Montevideo, Uruguay. A city of 650,000 people was about to host the first Football World Cup in history. To play in the first World Cup, Europe's teams had to board a ship and sail for 3 weeks. They had no idea what they were starting. These were the men who played the first World Cup match, and they were all amateurs. The referee placed the ball on the centre spot. France versus Mexico. 19th minute, the first goal in World Cup history. Lucien Laurent took it on the volley with his right foot. A quick handshake and we got on with the game. At the exact same moment across the city, the United States were beating Belgium 3-0, 2 World Cup matches, happening simultaneously. The world's game had begun twice at once. The final was played 17 days later, 93,000 people in the Estadio Centenario. Uruguay won 4-2, the first World Cup champions.
Lake Tanganyika, the longest freshwater lake on Earth, the place where science was about to change forever. A 26-year-old woman with no university degree crossed this lake in a small wooden boat. She stepped onto a pebble beach with a tent. The scientific establishment expected her to fail. The Gombe forest had never been studied. The chimpanzees had never seen a scientist. For the first weeks, they ran from her every time she came near. So she climbed to a high ridge she called the Peak and watched from a distance. Every day, for months. The first chimpanzee who allowed her close, she named David Greybeard, a senior male. When he accepted her, the rest of the community followed. She was in. Every night she wrote it all down by lamplight. The behaviours, the personalities, the names she gave them, which broke every rule of science at the time. She watched David Greybeard push a grass stem into a termite mound and pull it out covered in termites, a tool made by an animal. Chimpanzees share 98.7% of their DNA with humans. She proved they have personalities. She didn't study animals. She introduced us to our closest living relatives. Jane Goodall's study at Gombe is now the longest continuous wildlife study in history. It started on July 14, 1960, and a woman the scientific world told had no business being there.
Egypt, July 15, 1799. Buried in the walls of an ancient fort on the Nile Delta, a stone that had been waiting for 2,000 years to be found. Napoleon had brought an army of 35,000 soldiers to Egypt, with orders to seize every important artifact they found. At Fort Julian on the Nile, French engineering soldiers were reinforcing an ancient wall. The pickaxe hit something different, not the soft crumble of limestone, a ringing crack, dark stone, hard as iron, and on its face, 3 kinds of writing nobody could read. When they turned it face up, 3 scripts, running top to bottom, hieroglyphs at the top, 2 other languages below. Officer Pierre-Francois Bouchard could read the bottom section. It was ancient Greek, and if the same message was written in all 3 scripts, then the Greek was the key to everything above it. He ordered the stone taken to Cairo. The stone was wrapped in cloth, loaded onto a Nile barge, and sent upriver to Napoleon's scientists in Cairo. When Britain defeated Napoleon in Egypt, they took the Rosetta Stone as a war prize. It arrived in London in 1802. It has been in the British Museum ever since. Jean-Francois Champollion had been working on the stone for 20 years. Then in one afternoon it clicked. He burst into his brother's office screaming, "I've got it!" and fainted. Before that stone was found, these walls were beautiful and completely silent. After Champollion, every temple wall in Egypt began to speak. 2,000 years of human thought, unlocked by a pickaxe and a dark stone in a fort on the Nile.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
New Mexico Desert, July 16, 1945. Trinity test. A thunderstorm was battering the tower. Inside the bunkers, 250 scientists waited. The most powerful device ever built by human hands sat in the darkness, waiting. They called it the Gadget, a sphere of steel and plutonium, 5 feet across, sitting on a tower in the desert. One physicist worried it might ignite the nitrogen in the atmosphere and end all life on Earth. They decided to test it anyway. In the concrete bunker 6 miles away, none of them fully knew what was coming.
3.
A physicist read the countdown over the intercom.
1.
The light arrived first. Observers 6 miles away reported seeing the bones of their hands through the flash. The night became noon. The fireball reached a temperature hotter than the surface of the sun. The tower was gone. The sand beneath it had turned to glass. The light was visible 200 miles away. The mushroom cloud climbed to 38,000 feet, 7 miles high. Today, a small lava rock obelisk stands where the tower was. The desert is silent. Oppenheimer stood in the desert and remembered a line from the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Reims, France, July 17, 1429. For a decade the English had held northern France. Paris had fallen.
The King of France had no crown. Today that was going to change. The people of Reims had opened their gates to the man they hoped would be their king. They filled every street, every window. They had been waiting for this for a decade. Her name was Joan. She was 17 years old. 8 months ago she had been a farmer's daughter in a village no one had heard of. Now she was the reason a king was about to be crowned. Reims Cathedral. Built to crown kings, the nave vault rose 125 feet above the stone floor. When the morning sun came through the stained glass, the inside of the cathedral became a different world. The procession moved down the nave, 300 feet of the greatest Gothic cathedral in France. The Archbishop of Reims lifted the crown. 8 months before, France had no king. Joan of Arc had promised him this moment. Now it was here. She stood at the side, not at the altar, not receiving the crown, just watching. The news reached the streets before the procession did. For the first time in years, France had a king. Reims Cathedral is still standing. 33 kings of France were crowned here. The coronation of Charles VII, the one nobody thought possible, is the one history remembers. Montreal Forum, July 18, 1976. Nobody had heard of a 14-year-old from Romania named Nadia. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall. She had been training since she was 6. She stepped up to the chalk box, the same as she had 10,000 times before. She stepped to the bars. The arena went quiet. Every element exactly where it needed to be. Amplitude, precision, something the judges had never given a score to before, because they had never seen anything like it. She landed. She said later she wasn't even watching the scoreboard. She was already thinking about the next event. The scoreboard showed 1.00, a 10, a perfect 10, the first in Olympic history. Her coach had trained her since she was 6 years old, 14 years of work, one perfect score. Nobody imagined a score of 10.00 was possible. She won 3 gold medals at those games. She was 14 years old, the youngest all-around gymnastics champion in Olympic history. Seneca Falls, New York. July 19, 1848. The first women's rights convention ever held in America. When the organizers arrived that morning, the chapel was locked. The minister had forgotten to leave the key, so a 13-year-old boy climbed through a window and let them in. They packed into the wooden pews of a small unheated chapel and waited. Elizabeth Cady Stanton stood at the lectern in that small plain chapel and read aloud a document she had spent weeks writing, the Declaration of Sentiments. She had based it on the Declaration of Independence. With one difference. Where the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal, Stanton's document said all men and women are created equal. That was it. That was the change. Then came the vote on the most radical demand in the document, that women should have the right to vote. It was Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man who stood up in that room and said the vote must be included. His speech turned the room. The resolution passed. Narrowly. Of the 100 people who signed that declaration in 1848, only one lived to cast a vote. Her name was Charlotte Woodward. She went to the polling station in the autumn of 1920, and she placed her ballot in the box. In Houston, mission controllers in white shirts and narrow ties sat at pale green consoles surrounded by ashtrays, coffee mugs, and slide rules, guiding 2 human beings through a descent no one had ever attempted. Inside the Eagle, 2 men in white spacesuits stood at the controls as the grey-brown surface of the moon rushed toward their triangular windows. 12 minutes of powered descent with a computer less powerful than the phone in your pocket. The contact probes touched the surface. Neil Armstrong's voice broke across the void. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. 6 hours after landing, the hatch opened, one hand at a time down the ladder. In living rooms across the world, 650 million people sat in the dark. And then, the crunch. The first human footprint pressed into the Sea of Tranquility. A bootprint that will outlast every city on Earth, every mountain range, every ocean. It will still be there in 10 million years, long after everything we built has turned to dust. They planted a flag that could not wave. The moon has no wind. They collected 21 kilograms of another world and brought it home. And 650 million people looked up at the same moon that night, and knew that 2 of us were standing on it. One small step, one enormous, irreversible leap forward. July 20th, 1969, the night the human story changed its address.
In the summer of 356 BC, the greatest building on Earth stood on the Ionian coast of what is now Turkey. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus had taken 120 years to build. Ancient travellers who had seen every wonder of the known world wrote that when they looked upon it, everything else lost its brilliance. On the night of July 21st, 356 BC, a young Ephesian man named Herostratus walked into the temple. He carried oil-soaked linen and a burning lamp. He saturated the sacred tapestries. He climbed toward the great cedar roof beams, dark with centuries of incense resin, and he lit them. By midnight, the fire was visible from the Aegean Islands. The marble columns glowed orange between sheets of fire. The cedar roof burned as a single continuous flame. The statue of Artemis was consumed entirely. By dawn, of 127 columns, 30 remained standing. When they caught Herostratus, he told them exactly why he had done it. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his name to last forever. The Ephesians sentenced him to death and passed a law, damnatio memoriae, forbidding anyone, on pain of death, from ever speaking or writing his name. They tried to erase him completely. It didn't work. We are still saying his name 2,400 years later, but we remember Herostratus, which is exactly what the Ephesians were afraid of, and exactly what he wanted. The ancient historians later wrote that the goddess Artemis had been so distracted by the birth of a child that night that she had failed to protect her own temple. That child born that night was Alexander the Great. He would grow up to conquer the known world, and when he reached Ephesus, he offered to pay for the temple's reconstruction. The Ephesians politely declined. It was, they said, inappropriate for one god to build a temple for another. A 24-year-old sultan sat in a crimson silk tent on the plain west of Belgrade. 3 years earlier, he had taken Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world, in 53 days. Now he had 60,000 men, 300 cannons, and 200 warships chained across the Danube. He had been bombarding the fortress for 18 days. 2 sections of its walls had already fallen. Inside the fortress, a Hungarian nobleman named János Hunyadi had been fighting the Ottomans for 20 years. He had 5,000 men. He was drastically outnumbered, but he had a plan. That night, the Janissaries breached the walls and entered the city, but Hunyadi had ordered tar, sulphur, and animal fat laid in the outer moat. As the Janissaries advanced, the fire was lit. A wall of sulphur green and orange flame sealed the moat behind them. They could not advance, they could not retreat. They were trapped between the fortress above and the fire below. A 70-year-old barefoot Franciscan friar, named Giovanni da Capistrano, he shouted, "The Lord who made the beginning will take care of the finish," and 25,000 farmers crossed the river. At dawn on July 22nd, Hunyadi rode out from the fortress gate into the Ottoman cannon positions. Capistrano's crusaders hit the Ottoman rear from the Sava. The Ottomans were struck from 2 sides they hadn't expected. The Sultan himself joined the fighting. 60,000 men left 300 cannons in the mud and retreated. Pope Calixtus III ordered all Christian churches to ring their bells at noon in 1456 to celebrate the Christian victory over the Ottoman Turks at the Siege of Belgrade. Somewhere in the world it rings because of a battle on the Danube that most people have never heard of. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the soldiers climbing those stairs already knew which sultan they served. For 14 months, father and son had lived under the same roof and never spoken a single word. His only contact with the outside world arrived hidden inside cassette tapes, secret messages from the British, smuggled past his father's guards. The plan wasn't drawn up in Salalah. It was drawn up in London and quietly approved at the highest level of government. When the door finally gave way, there was no battle waiting on the other side, only an empty room and a man who had already fled deeper into his own palace. In the end, the only blood spilled that night was the Sultan's own. He had ruled for 38 years. He left his palace after midnight, in silence, and never set foot in Oman again. Yesterday, Oman was in darkness, but that morning, a new dawn rose, and the Sultan who rose with it would go on to rule for 49 years. Within days, the old laws were gone. Radios, long band, played openly in homes for the very first time. Long before sultans or coups, this same hillside had already been giving the world something it could not get anywhere else. Frankincense, harvested exactly like this for over 5,000 years. He inherited a country with 10 kilometers of paved road. By the time he was finished, Oman would have 12,000. This was the night Oman changed kings, the coup that ended decades of isolation.
and the morning that quietly began one of the most remarkable transformations in modern Middle Eastern history. A local farmer told him of ruins hidden on a mountain few outsiders had ever climbed. By morning, the only way forward was a bridge of logs and vines, stretched across a river that wanted to take him. For 2 more hours, he climbed through freezing rain, certain the mountain was hiding something worth the pain. It wasn't an archaeologist who found the final path. It was an 11-year-old boy who had walked it many times before. And then, through the mist, he saw it. Stone terraces, hundreds of them, climbing a mountain no outsider had mapped in centuries. The stones fit so precisely, not even a blade could slide between them, and no one alive could say exactly how it was done. What he'd found wasn't just a ruin. It was an entire lost city, swallowed whole by the mountain for nearly 400 years. He spent that afternoon sketching what he saw, not knowing his notes would introduce Machu Picchu to the entire world. But here's the twist almost no one talks about. When he got there, he found a date already carved into the stone, 10 years earlier, and 3 names that weren't his. He didn't discover Machu Picchu. He just told the rest of the world where to find it. On July 24th, 1911, in the freezing Andean rain, one of history's greatest discoveries turned out to have already been found. All night, his own men argued his fate in a room he wasn't even allowed to truly control. By dawn, 19 votes had already ended 21 years of absolute power, and he barely reacted at all. The next morning, almost unbelievably, he walked into his office as if nothing had happened. For the first time in over 2 decades, the most powerful phone line in Italy had nothing to tell him. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, he walked into the royal villa exactly as he always had, utterly certain that nothing would change. The king had let him rule for over 20 years without ever once standing in his way. That was about to end, and then, calmly, almost gently, the king told him it was over. 21 years of fascist rule ended in under 2 minutes of quiet conversation. He walked out of that villa a completely different man than the one who'd walked in, dazed, incredulous, and no longer in charge of anything at all. 21 years of absolute power ended in the back of a Red Cross ambulance, on a quiet gravel driveway, with the evening Roman sun going down behind him. And here's the detail almost nobody remembers. The man who voted to end his rule that night was his own son-in-law. This was the day Il Duce discovered that even dictators eventually run out of audience. The most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere is carried into a plaza on a golden litter by 80 nobles. A friar stepped forward and handed him a book. Atahualpa held it to his ear, listening for a voice, heard nothing, and let it fall to the ground. That was the signal. Spanish soldiers poured from the doorways on every side. Horses, steel, chaos, but Atahualpa was still thinking like an emperor. He looked around the room where they held him, stretched his arm above his head and drew a line on the wall. "Fill this room with gold up to that line," he said, "and I walk free." For 8 months the gold came. Life-sized golden llamas. All of it melted down in 9 forges burning day and night beside the plaza. The ransom was paid in full. Pizarro signed the execution order anyway. The charges were invented. The sentence was death by fire. But for the Inca, fire meant the soul could never pass into the afterlife. So a priest offered him a choice. Accept baptism. Die by the rope instead of the flame. Atahualpa said yes. He was baptized under torchlight that same night. And hours later, in the same plaza where he had arrived as a god, he was gone. The Inca nobles who had watched it all from the doorways. Men who had served the Sapa Inca their entire lives, who had no army left and no emperor to answer to, stood in silence. Out in the Andes, a general was already on the road to Cajamarca, with 15,000 porters loaded with more gold. When word reached him that Atahualpa was dead, he turned the entire convoy around, sent it back into the mountains. By morning the plaza was empty, a reed mat on the ground. The Inca Empire didn't fall on a battlefield. It fell in one afternoon, in one plaza, to less than 200 men. Before sunrise in the summer of 1921, one window in a Toronto medical building was still burning. Inside, 2 young men were about to end one of history's longest death sentences, with a wooden table no one could even properly sterilize. Frederick Banting was 29, a surgeon with no research record and barely any money. Charles Best was 22, fresh out of his degree, working 12-hour days for almost nothing. They had failed 7 times already. But on July 27th, they tried again. They ground the tissue by hand. They strained it through cloth. And at 11:15, Banting pressed the plunger into a dying dog's leg, and there was nothing left to do but watch. Every 30 minutes they waited, saying nothing. Then the test tube changed colour. The numbers had moved. For the first time in medical history, a measurement of blood sugar had gone down instead of up, because of something 2 men had made with their own hands in a room nobody else wanted. They didn't celebrate. They just looked at each other and breathed. That evening, they sat on the rooftop of that same building, with no idea that they had just made dying of diabetes optional for tens of millions of people who hadn't even been born yet. July 28th, 1540. 1 king, 2 fates, sealed on the very same morning. In London, on Tower Hill, 1,000 armed guards line the path as Thomas Cromwell walks to his death. 10 years ago, this man built an empire out of paperwork. Miles away, in a small private chapel in Surrey, the king he served is getting married. Henry, nearly 50 now, his body wrecked by old wounds, leans on a cane to reach the altar. Waiting for him, Catherine Howard, 17 years old, a teenager about to become Queen of England, with no idea what's coming for her in just 18 months. The ring goes on her finger at almost the exact hour the axe falls on Tower Hill. Henry never watched it happen. He never had to. That was the genius and the horror of being king. Other men did the dying for him. Thomas Cromwell does something remarkable. In his final words, he doesn't beg. He doesn't curse his enemies. He asks for forgiveness, and he prays for his family's safety, protecting the people he loves. By nightfall, Cromwell's head sits on a spike on London Bridge, and in a candlelit room in Surrey, the king raises a toast to his new bride. 2 fates, 1 day. 1 king who walked away from both completely unchanged. Late July 1609. A French explorer named Samuel de Champlain is about to fire the first gunshot in a war that will last 150 years. Champlain has thrown in with the Algonquin, the Huron, and the Montagnais, peoples of the St. Lawrence River. Their price? Help us fight the Mohawk. So here he is, on a long, narrow lake that will one day bear his name. The Mohawks step out from behind their barricade, 200 strong, led by 3 chiefs marked out by towering feather plumes. Champlain and 2 other Frenchmen are hidden in the tree line, completely unseen. When the Mohawk chiefs raise their bows, Champlain steps into the open, alone, in steel armour they have never laid eyes on. 1 shot. 2 chiefs fall at once. The Mohawk, they break, they run. Champlain will later say he was just trying to keep a trading partner happy, but that 1 shot just told an entire confederacy of nations that the rules of war on this continent had changed forever. The Indianapolis had just finished the most secret mission of the war. She'd raced across the Pacific carrying the core of the atomic bomb that would fall on Hiroshima, because the mission was top secret. The Navy didn't even know she was missing. 4 days later, just after midnight on July 30th, 1945, a Japanese submarine slides out of the dark and fires 6 torpedoes. 2 find their mark. The ship goes dark in an instant. Below decks, 18 and 19-year-old kids wake up in pitch black, smoke filling the compartments, water already rising. They scramble in the dark, hands grabbing at walls they can't see, pushing toward hatches they can't find. And some of those hatches get dogged down, sealed shut, with men still inside. McCoy was the last one out. He never forgot the sound of the men hollering not to leave them in there. And they jump. The ship is already pulling the ocean in around itself, the suction dragging everything down with it. 900 men hit the water. The ship is gone in 12 minutes. That first morning, groups form. The ones who still have the strength to tread water hold up the ones who don't. The doctor moves between the groups with nothing. He keeps their heads up. He tells them to hold on. But men keep disappearing. The Pacific in July is warm. The water is clear, tropical clear, clear enough to see the sharks. Survivor Lowell Cox later said they were there every single moment, dozens of fins at a time, down there in the blue, patient, circling below the kicking legs like they had all the time in the world, coming up out of the deep like lightning. A cargo net floats somewhere in that field of survivors. 15 men on it, then 20, then 30. 10 sharks hit it at once. The net goes quiet, the water goes still. And 5 days into the silence, a pilot named Chuck Gwynn is on a routine patrol when a trailing antenna breaks. And then he sees the people. He radios back what he finds. Another pilot, Adrian Marks, arrives and sees the sharks circling. He takes a boat of his crew and lands a flying boat in 12-foot swells. 316 men came home out of nearly 1,200. The rest belonged to the sea. And the sharks that found them that night are still out there, still cruising the same dark water, patient, ancient, and waiting. On July 31st, 1954, 2 men became heroes for reaching the top of the world's second highest mountain, K2, 28,000 feet of black rock and ice in the Karakoram. On the night of July 30th, Mehdi and a young climber named Walter Bernardi were sent up the mountain carrying 40-pound oxygen tanks, the tanks the summit team would need to survive the final push. When they finally reached the spot, there was nothing there. Bernardi shouted into the dark until a voice finally answered from somewhere above. "Leave the oxygen. Go back down." Bernardi tried to explain. Mehdi couldn't make it down in the dark. Mehdi wasn't given proper boots for this kind of cold. That night, at over 26,000 feet, 2 human beings sat back to back in the open, with no tent, no sleeping bags, and temperatures plunging to 50 below zero. The next morning, the 2 Italian climbers retrieved the oxygen tanks Mehdi and Bernardi had nearly died carrying, and walked onto the summit. Amir Mehdi made it down the mountain, but his feet were ruined. Surgeons amputated every toe on both feet. The men on the summit got their names in every history book. The man who made it possible got nothing, for 50 years, but cold feet and silence.